being deep in somebody's head is an unnatural place to be. Like, you're not really allowed to go there normally.
Welcome to the Neurosurgery Podcast. I'm Mike Wang, and I'm here with my co-host, J.P. Kolcun. We are here to discuss all things neurosurgical.
Hi, this is J.P. Kolcun, a resident in neurosurgery at Rush University. Please note that this is not a CME event, and the opinions and statements made in this podcast do not reflect those of any institution or professional organization. Now, let's get started.
So today we're very lucky to be joined by Nick Boulis. Nick Boulis is really what I would call a micro-celebrity, and that's not an insult, that's a high compliment. A micro-celebrity is someone who within their field or specialty is really a celebrity. And Nick has been a friend for years, and really, I mean, one of the most riveting aspects about Nick is you can't get over his personality, which is just huge. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thanks, Mike.
Great. So you're really an interesting person who tries to do so many different things, and I wanted to talk to you about psychology. And I know you know a lot about a lot of things, and we could talk about any topic, but I kind of wanted to delve into this concept of like what is the psychology of a neurosurgeon, and what would you say is like the quintessential profile, and like do you fit it?
I think that I fit parts of that profile. I mean, I think if we dive into the quintessential characteristics of the neurosurgeon, number one, I think that we require immediate consequence of action to validate the value of any action in particular. That is, we're not good on deferring the feedback, right? There's something inherent about operating that you know whether you did good or did bad, did well or bad immediately. And I think that's part of it. I think the other emphasis there is the consequence of action. We crave a very heavy consequence. We crave durable consequence. And I think for me that's incredibly important because I was searching for something, a lifestyle that would make my actions matter in that moment, so that I believe it enhances our level of experience because, quite frankly, we pay attention, or you're forced to pay attention. And in particular with me, I grew up with raging ADD. I have a very hard time paying attention to things, and neurosurgery was one of the very few things that captured my attention. I don't think that's true of all neurosurgeons. I think many neurosurgeons are far more inherently focused, but I do think that we all crave that heavy, immediate consequence of action to validate our experience.
So one of the better validated models in psychological literature to look at and analyze personality on an individual level and populations is the big 5 personality traits. Those are openness to new experiences, conscientiousness, which you kind of touched on there with the ability to focus in on a single task, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. In your thoughts about yourself, about your colleagues in neurosurgery, about young trainees coming up in the field, which of those would you hone in on as maybe the most important aspect when considering this field?
Well, first of all, could you write them down, and I'll go through the list. I mean, neuroticism I don't think is important, but I think it is a what I would call a covariant. I think people that are drawn to neurosurgery tend to be outliers because it takes a certain person to accept all this consequence of action, all this, for want of a better word, just stress. But we're drawn to it, and we can explore why people are drawn to it, but I think we're, in general, outliers. And I think whenever you take a group of outliers, you're going to find a higher titer of neuroticism in that mix. So I don't think that that's causal.
You keep returning to this concept of the consequence of action.
Right.
Too often in life, and especially in a high-stakes surgery and a trauma, that consequence is negative. But you find satisfaction or fulfillment just being in a scenario that has immediate consequence, whether or not it's good or bad.
Correct. In fact, I think it's important that either valence is possible, and I say that there's a huge reward and there's huge punishment when things go wrong, and we're not always in control, but we're always responsible, right? So I think it comes back to what I originally said, which is it elevates the intensity of experience, because what's going to happen matters. It's going to be really great, and you're going to own that, or it's going to be really bad, and you have to own that also. So coming back to the list or your list, I don't think extroversion is necessarily important for neurosurgery. I happen to be extroverted. Mike happens to be extremely extroverted. It's one of the ways we get along, but I don't think it bears on our capacity to act as surgeons. It may bear on our ability to interface with patients. It certainly bears on our ability to engage in leadership in the field. As for agreeableness, I put that in the same category. I don't think I think you can be disagreeable and still be a highly effective neurosurgeon. In fact, many of our role models took pride in not having to be agreeable or extroverted. They believed, I think, that their capacity to deliver in these high stress situations was enough. And it was sort of part of what was really important was a high level of confidence. And that sometimes that confidence, that perhaps narcissism worked against extroversion and agreeableness. I think that's less true now. I think that in medical training, there's an expectation that you connect with people. But I think at the end of the day, the sine qua non is how we perform when we're in the operating room and our capacity to make good decisions about who goes to the operating room, and be decisive about in both spheres. So openness to experience and conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is absolutely critical. I just think right now on this list, that's topping the list for me for being a good neurosurgeon. Although I don't think it's good enough to be conscientious, but perhaps it may be, because I think we can agree that with regard to the issue of technical virtuosity, our ability to execute highly complicated, dexterous activity under pressure, right? That we recognize in the samurais of our field, right? Not everybody's going to be a samurai. But I think people can choose where along that continuum they want to be. At the end of the day, you still have to be conscientious. I do a lot of deep brain stimulation. That requires almost no virtuosity with regard to this dexterous capacity to execute under pressure, right? Which I think is one of the core value systems of our field, but it really requires conscientiousness.
Yeah.
I mean, I tell people, this is not me being a fighter pilot. I have other operations for that. This is me being the captain of a super tanker, where you got to pay attention to the details, and ultimately you own the same kinds of horrible outcomes if you're not going to do that. So I put that at the top of the list. I think the openness to experience, I would put that number 2 in this list, because I think where that lies is the difference between somebody being a good neurosurgeon and being an exceptional neurosurgeon, because no matter what, you can't be timid. You have to be willing to go places which are going to be novel. And coming back to the ADD thing with me, I would never be able to sustain a career where the experiences weren't renewed and new. Doing the same thing over and over again would be nearly impossible for me.
So Nick, I mean, you have a very interesting life history, and I don't want to rehash it all, but like you went to college at Yale, right?
Yeah.
And one of the really interesting things about you is that your roommate is also a very well-known neurosurgeon, right?
Well, actually, in as the Lawrence Hall, which was the dorm facility for Ezra Stiles College at Yale, it contained, well, it housed me, Arun Amar, who was one of your co-residents, and frankly, how we got to be such good friends, who was my roommate and very close friend, and Andy Parsa, who I wasn't that close to.
The late Andy Parsa, yeah.
That's correct. I was not that close to Andy at Yale, but I grew to be close to him. And during residency, even though we ended up in different residencies, because we were pursuing such a similar core value of becoming a clinician scientist, and there are benchmarks for that.
So
yeah.
I want to take you back 30 years.
Okay.
You're back at Yale now, okay? I know, it's scary. You're looking around at your class, 2,000 kids, 1,500 kids, whatever it is. Everybody there pretty much is very bright.
Right.
They've got promising futures. They're very accomplished. Do you think you could go back and pick out the people that would, A, become neurosurgeons, and B, the ones that would be good at it? Like, just by knowing who they are.
This is one of those, when Arun announced, probably during his time at UCSF, of course we were really close.
This is his medical school years.
Yeah, he went off, he did a fellowship in pathology, and then went to UCSF. I went off to Harvard, and we were, of course, communicating. At Yale, I was absolutely obsessed by the mechanics of consciousness. I did a major in biology in the psychology track, which was then neurobiology. I did another major in philosophy in the psychology track. Basically, it was mind and brain studies. I was completely obsessed with this stuff. Arun was more interested in broad philosophy, phenomenology, etc. But when he got to medical school, began professing a desire to become a brain surgeon. And I thought to myself, I remembered this guy who, frankly, was fairly timid when it came to, say, going sledding on the cafeteria trays that we used to go to the div school and go crashing down this hill, which had like wrought iron fence at the bottom. and Arun was like the last person lining up to do that, and I was like obviously gung ho. And I just thought about that and thought, he doesn't seem like he's brave enough to do this, and yet he became a vascular neurosurgeon. I became the functional nerve pain guy. So I mean, any day of the week, it takes more testosterone to take on aneurysms than the kind of stuff I do.
That's a great follow-up podcast as to how you can determine what your best subspecialty of neurosurgery should be.
Right.
We could even devise a test for that, like a little personality test, right? So it's interesting to me because a lot of our listeners, we believe, are people who are interested in neurosurgery as a phenomenon, but are not actually neurosurgeons.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe people who want to be neurosurgeons, aspiring people, high school kid, medical school resident. Not a resident, but college kids, and I certainly have my sort of prototypical big five personality trait of a neurosurgeon, and what you need and what you don't need. But you and I both run into lots of folks who come for mentorship, and they don't seem to have I don't want to say the right, because there's not just one right personality, but they don't seem to fit that bill. Right. Do you think those people, A, should change to become the quintessential neurosurgeon, and B, are capable of changing who they are?
Again, there is a continuum within neurosurgery that can allow for variance in personality types. I think that people are far more likely to be happy and successful if they can find a activity and category that matches with their personality. I think an attempt to change your personality by the time you're ready to choose a medical discipline, let alone a subspecialty, I think that ship sailed.
Well,
and I think if you try to adapt because you are trying to achieve some label or put yourself into a mold that you weren't meant for, I think that's psychologically discordant, and I think you're destined for trouble.
So I'm sure you have the analog at Emory in Atlanta, but we have this like Camp Neuro for high schoolers, and all these high school kids,
Wow.
they're all beaming, bright-eyed. They come in, and and half of them, full half, say they want to be a brain surgeon, and maybe they don't know the difference between a neurologist and a neurosurgeon or whatever, because they couldn't be any more different, right? But they come to you and they're asking for this advice, and I keep thinking to myself, I don't know if you saw that movie Rocket Man about
Not yet.
Elton John. Okay, it's really good. It's very well done. And there's this great part where someone's talking to the young Elton John, the pre-famous.
Right.
He's not even a micro celebrity yet. And they say to him, the guy says to him, the
Macro
more
celebrity.
experienced rock star says, in order to be the person you want to be, you have to kill the person you are. And I sometimes think, and I don't know if this is true, it's a theory of mine, that residency is in some ways killing off, like the neural pruning, when
Yeah.
you're a
Yeah,
teenager,
yeah.
killing off a part of you that's not acceptable in our field or not conducive to good outcomes, whatever label you'll put on it, right? It's changing you to be something that's proven to be more effective.
Okay. So I have two immediate responses
Okay, yeah,
to
please.
that. Hopefully I can get these out before I lose track. But number one, I believe very strongly in that that neurosurgery training is just that. It's training. It's not an education. It is embedding motor memory. It is a molding and adaptation of our identities. And in particular, part of that, and it's pertinent to the whole 80-hour work week thing, when I became a neurosurgeon, I wanted to be part of an elite corps, and I was willing to sacrifice for that, and without the sacrifice, it would not be an elite corps.
That's very well put.
And I wanted to make that sacrifice. I mean, I wanted to bleed for it, and it's hard, I think, having come through that era, to relinquish the idea that there's something about our identity that is earned through that suffering, for example, and that hardening per se. I mean, I view neurosurgery training appropriately to be like the forging of a katana, where the blade is heated and hammered, and
Bolted
heated
1,000
and hammered
times.
and heated and hammered
To the molecular
to the point
level.
where it is a sharp,
Yep.
honed tool, and that's what we ought to be. And I think we should, in the process of making the decision to be a neurosurgeon, we surrender to that, and we're going to miss a lot of, for example, enlightened experiences because we need to be focused in that process of hammering and folding. Okay, so I think that that's the way it ought to be. Frankly, I don't hear anybody clamoring for kinder and gentler duty hours for our SEALs, and I feel like we're the SEALs of medicine, and it ought to be that way.
I have a great line. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No, it's-
when I come to see my patients in admitting for surgery, they always ask the same question, Dr. Wang, did you get a good night's rest? And I always give them the same answer. If you have to ask that question, you picked the wrong surgeon, because it doesn't matter. They don't ask the SEALs. We just interviewed a SEAL earlier today. Do you feel like killing Osama bin Laden today? It's not up to you. You're trained to not, it doesn't
That's
matter,
right.
right?
You need to be able to deliver regardless of your state. So that's thought number one.
Okay.
Thought number two gets to the point that I'm listening to you, and it's interesting because when I started my career wanting to be a clinician scientist, I mean, what's the pinnacle of success as a clinician scientist, academic neurosurgeon?
Nobel Prize.
Well, how many Nobel Prizes have been awarded to neurosurgeons? Not many.
NIH.
I think that's a good one too. But to me, it's becoming the chairman of a program. So, and frankly, when you commit yourself to spending a lot of your actual working hours killing rats instead of killing people, you're going to get paid less. But when you get if you get to the top of the food chain as a chairman, well, then other people have to do the operating, and that's you're not benchmarked necessarily to RVUs. Now that may not be true everywhere, but it also was a good financial model for me. So when I set out on my goal to become the very best clinician scientist that I could, to me, the hallmark of success was becoming a chairman. But the closer I got to that, and the more I interviewed for those positions, the more I realized, first of all, as the chairman, I would have to actually reinforce or enforce rules, and I am probably the worst person to enforce rules because I love breaking rules. That being essentially middle management in a university would be like the absolute worst job for me, and that ultimately I want to express and achieve my own agenda, not like embrace the agenda of the group a whole lot. So what I realized was I was trying to be and become something that wasn't me, and I went a totally different direction, which was, adapt my expectations to fit who I realized I was. So, I've kind of gone in a different direction.
So I want to ask, because you mentioned that, because we were just talking about this recently, Dr. Wang. Shooting from the hip, are neurosurgeons rule followers or rule breakers?
That is a great question.
The quintessential neurosurgeon we're discussing.
Okay, so there was a moment in my residency where a guy named Mike Polensky, who was one of my senior residents, chief resident at the time, I think I was a junior, that junior chief relationship that's really close, you really respect that person. I can't quite remember what he said, but what I realized was that part of why I absolutely loved neurosurgery is being deep in somebody's head is an unnatural place to be. Like, you're not really allowed to go there normally, and yet we can. So it was like at the heart of breaking some really fundamental rules about human behavior, like taking the back of somebody's head off and going down in there and having to look around. What I realized was that for Polensky, neurosurgery had nothing to do with breaking the rules and that the risk that was involved. I mean, to him, it was about orderly obeying the rules such that he could carry out the task. So I know where I stand on that continuum, but I don't necessarily think all neurosurgeons need to be inveterate rule breakers.
But I think that's a great question, because I think that if you look at our DNA, it's Harvey Cushing, right? Or Dandy. And these were guys that were taking on stuff that nobody would touch because it was basically a death sentence to go through a surgery, right? So that part is the rule breaking. Right? The big picture.
Those guys created the field.
Right.
They were the innovators,
But
right?
but we're going to be interviewing a lot of innovators like yourself, like John Adler.
Yep.
Neurosurgeons invented basically like half the stuff that's out there, right? I mean, it's crazy the amount of innovation for 1% of doctors. So I think at the high level, we're the rule breakers, but I think that in order to engage and not have errant results, you have to be very disciplined at the micro detail, like a Navy SEAL. Navy SEAL has to be absolutely detailed on how they execute their rifle maneuvers or shooting, but then the big picture, they have to be flexible.
And they wear beards.
Right, and so it's very parallel. I think it's very much a parallel.
Yeah, I mean, listen, depends on your practice, depends on where you want to go. It's somebody has said that the creativity in surgery, you don't need creativity in surgery when things are going right.
Yeah.
You need to be creative when things start to go wrong.
Just like the SEALs.
Right? Yeah, it's when your planning doesn't account for what is happening, and it can't always. That's when you need to be creative, and it's a particular type of creativity, right? Because you got to execute it on the spot, and have confidence in your actions, right? Well, see the solution and follow it, and stand by it.
Nick, we could talk for hours. We could talk about politics. We could talk about drugs. We can talk
we're
about
not
Burning
talking about
Man. We
politics.
can talk about anything, right? And your science and the great work you're doing in ALS. And I hope you find the cure, or part of the cure, maybe an arm of it. And congratulations on all your innovations. And really want to thank you for the time you took to come talk to us today.
Right on.
Thank you,
Anytime.
sir.